All right, in this video, I'm going to show you how to paint in the style of Red Dead Redemption 2. Now, this style is pretty simple, but of course it's not easy. And especially if you're a beginner, it's probably going to be hard to follow along. That's why I'm going to make it beginner friendly, because there are some prerequisites that you need to understand in order to do this properly. But I'm going to show you with a very simple concept how the complex thing here on the screen that we're going to end up with, so the end result, how we actually can get there with a simple version. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start by first just drawing a very simple egg, right? I'm going to rough that in, and I'm going to give the egg a hat similar to what I have in the picture. So something like that, that has a bit of a brim and a bit of depth, like this. Bit of a fedora head. The egg is going to stay the same. We're not going to do a face, right? You'll see the step-by-step in the process that I'll show you here on the screen. I'm just going to make this or turn this into an egg to illustrate my point. And I'm also going to give this egg a collar similar to what we see on the screen, like that, so that you can follow along. All right, so that is that. Okay, we don't need to ink this in right now, because that's only going to make things harder. So it's going to be a bit different. The process is going to be a bit different traditionally versus digitally, because digitally you can use layers, of course. Traditionally, I cannot. So getting into it, what you do to get to the style of Red Dead Redemption, which is pretty much a very graphic style. It's very inkerly. It's very comic art stylish, especially like Western comic art. It's very heavily reliant on understanding inking and how to shadow map, particularly how to shadow map and how to effectively use tone. So we'll get right into it. What you do is digitally, I have this sort of line drawing, right? It's very similar to what I have here. It's just a penciled in line drawing. Then next up, what you actually do is you start then just filling in your flats, just the basic flats. Now, there's a couple of things that we'll see is that, so the flats in this case, right, will be a local color. So I'm going to rough that in, and my egg should have probably been a bit smaller, but I'm committed now. So here we go. I have a local color for the egg. I'm going to actually not do something here, which I'll explain later. So don't worry about it now. But for those of you that are thinking like, he's skipping some parts of the egg, that's on purpose. Let's get in the local color like this. I'm going to do the same for the hat, which in this case, I'm only going to need this part like this. All right. And then the color as well. I'll just do the entire color for now. Like this and like this. Right, so actually this is very graphic, right? We're keeping it very graphic. We're keeping it very simple to understand. That's all we need to do. What you'll see as well in the Red Dead Redemption style is that the color of the clothing, actually anything that is not necessarily skin tone, unless they want to punch it up a little bit, highlighted, is very muted because it's a fairly realistic game. And it's also a semi-realistic art style. It has been stylized, but it is fairly realistic, especially with how they treat the shadow shapes and everything. That is that, right? So we have our local color basically down. There can be multiple local colors like you see I have here on the gun. Overall, I keep it pretty simple. Now, we could make this more interesting, which I also do a little bit in the clothing, is that we do some color variation in the blues. You can enrich them a little bit if you want to. Although in this case, I would keep it fairly muted down. So then next step, this step number 3 in this case, would be, and this is probably the hardest, and it's going to be the hardest for a lot of you to understand, is the shadow mapping. So this is a very graphical, comic style of shadow mapping. Basically, it's putting everything that would fall into shadow, primarily in this case, I would say the ambient occlusions, as well as just the overall shadow map, would be made black, or at least very close to black. And so what that means, if we do the egg example here, is that basically everything. And when I say everything, by the way, I mean everything that is not skin tone. So they do this pretty deliberately to make the skin tone stand out, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But overall, so what they do is they take everything that would be casting a shadow or would be falling into shadow, they use blacks. Just very similar to what they would do in comics. So in this case, we'd have this completely in shadow. And now what that does when you use blacks, and this is why it works so effectively in comics as well, is because the readability of your artwork just increases instantly. As you see, as well as what I'm doing here, it's like the readability of what I've drawn or what I'm drawing, it punches everything upward because we're using blacks. So by default, we are creating a lot more contrast in our art just by using those blacks. I could even add a little bit of a black rim, very subtly, but not too much. And we would also have blacks from cast shadows. So they're choosing a particular light source, right? So in this case, the light source, let's say, is coming from this in like a 45-degree angle or something. And so the egg itself, if you know a bit of shadow mapping, the egg is going to have a shadow side, but the hat is going to cast a shadow onto the egg or the face. But in this case, we're not doing black because that's on the skin tone, but it is going to cast a shadow on the collar. So the collar is going to get a cast shadow like this from the egg. And we're not only doing the cast shadow, we're also doing like the folding that the collar might have from it being clothing and drapery, right? So it's not only cast shadow, it's also like what is considered a fold, how are we communicating that fold, what are the ambient occlusions that we have because of the folding. So all of that is taken into consideration to create a very graphic tone, to create a very like graphic pleasing tone. Even something as light as a shirt, like a white shirt, as you can see here, as I have in the example that I made, right? This is not from Red Dead Redemption. This is something I just made myself to illustrate how you can draw in that style. But even the shirt itself has like black shading, which is very counterintuitive to do this, but it makes the style very unique and it makes it very graphic and pleasing to look at. They would start shadow mapping all of this with blacks. Even in the hat, there is like blacks for where there is folding from the hat, like the brim of the hat, like this. If the hat would have something wrapping around it, it would also get that very graphic treatment. And for this, you of course need to understand how to shade simple form. Like, okay, this is like a cylindrical type of form, so we would need to shade it accordingly. So that is that. So you have your graphic representation. Basically, this is shadow mapping at its finest. And the reason this is hard is because to understand shadow mapping, you need to understand form and how you draw on top of form and how you indicate three-dimensionality of form. But then the extra level of difficulty here is to also make that design pleasing. And what I mean by that is that you can have an egg and you can give it a graphic. So basically, this is a graphic shadow shape for an egg. And you can make that graphically more pleasing. Now, for an egg, it's very hard, but even then, you can put design into that shading. So instead of everything being almost equal in width, you could have a shadow shape that is thin and then thicker and nicely curved, and even have this line dicker type of indication like this. So there would be better graphic design to it. Now, of course, that graphic design still needs to correlate and communicate the form itself. You cannot break that. Otherwise, you're going to lose believability. So you cannot shade this egg like this because it's no longer going to feel like an egg because you're losing that form indication, right? So that's why there's an extra level of difficulty when you shade very graphically and do shadow mapping because you need to understand that, right? So that's why I'm saying that this tutorial isn't necessarily beginner friendly, but I'm trying to explain it for you so that you understand it later. Okay, then step 4 is actually we're going to add the background. Now, the reason we do that is because we're going to have to give some context to how we want to shade, or like the type of shading we want to use. Now, of course, when you do this digitally, no one cares, right? It doesn't matter. You can do it. You can do the background from the start. You can do it whenever you want. I'm just going to give this a bit of context around the hat like this, and on the other side as well. Then let's give that background some color variation real quick. We have basically our environment. Now, this is important because the shadows that we're going to include now in step 5 need to relate to the environment, because usually your shadow side, like the thing that is in shadow, everything from your subject matter that is in shadow, is going to be influenced by the environment, because all of the bounce light in the environment is going to fill up that shadow. What does that mean? Is, as you'll see in step 5. Oh, and just as a quick note on step 4, at this point, what you also want to do, which I don't have in this egg, right? In this egg, I don't have it, although we could quickly include it. Like, let's say, what you want to do is you want to refine at this point, maybe the blacks, especially when you're working digitally, the blacks in your design, right? So you want to clear those out, because you're going to add some detailing to the face or the beard, as you can see here, like with the mustache that I have. I'm not going to do that yet. For me, this is the last step because I'm working traditionally. And so this would be the finishing touch that I do on top, because then I can do it over all of the paint instead of the paint still influencing the blacks that I put in here. Okay, so you see that sometimes you have to be creative when you're working traditionally versus digitally. So you'll see now that in step 5, what we're doing is now we're adding the shadow shape. Now we're adding the shadow shape for the skin tones. We're already actually added them for the everything else, basically for the clothing, the drapery, maybe the gun he's holding. These are those dark blacks. This is basically the inking, sort of cross-hatching almost, that has been done to graphically punch the image, right? Without it, you get a very flat image. So the darks, and then we're using, for the shadow shape, we're using a richer color because the background is very red, right? In Red Dead Redemption, almost all of the backgrounds are pretty saturated, usually very red. It's Red Dead Redemption. And so there's a lot of red in the environments, which means that, and I don't really have the right color for this, but which means that the shadows themselves, as you can see in my digital image, are going to be very rich in that color as well. And so again, we had the light coming from this side, so that means that everything that is affected by the light is now going to cast like a shadow on top of my egg, and it's also going to influence the form indication of my egg. Right, so let's say this is my egg. This is the shadow shape of my egg, like that. That egg is also going to cast a shadow onto this imaginary neck that I have as well, like this. Right, so basically anything that is going to be in shadow from the skin tones, which is the face, the nose is going to cast a shadow, like you can see here, the neck, the chin, the hat is casting a shadow on top of the head. So all of that is going to be in shadow. You are now picking one particular color that's a very rich, warm, saturated color for that shadow. And then on top of that, what they also tend to do, just to make sure that you understand that this is almost like a fill light and not necessarily the shadow alone, is that they add a graphic representation of the Terminator. Now, if all of this terminology is foreign to you, the Terminator is basically where the light meets the shadow. That's usually one of the more darker parts of the shadow shapes. So for my egg, it would be for both the cast shadow and the form shadow, but particularly the form shadow, I would indicate a darker value Terminator. So that is step 5. Then step 6 is halftones. And I told you already, I love halftones because halftones are basically what's going to give us three-dimensionality. If you look at it before, it was more of this posterized image. What they do very smartly in Red Dead Redemption is they make a very graphic statement. So they only use one value, or usually one value, to indicate the halftone. And halftone is basically really what's going to give form to your subject matter. And so what they do is they everything that will still have form, like you see here, what I have in the face with the cheeks and the nose, and the bottom, and especially where the terminator of the shadow meets the light side of the face, it will also they will also use this halftone or midtone. So in this case, I could be like, okay, I'm gonna follow that to basically to soften the transition between the shadow and the light, right? And let's say my egg would have a cheek, I would also we would also create like very pleasing graphic shapes to indicate that. Because now we're basically indicating halftones. And I could do it here as well, because there's going to be a little bit of that translucency, or that light is going to warm up this part of the shadow as well. And so these are basically the four colors we use for the skin tone. It's a very light one for the skin itself, then a more saturated one for the halftones, then a pretty dark, rich one for the shadow shape, and then maybe a bit more of a muted, darker one for the Terminator. And this all together creates sort of this very graphic but pleasing effect for the skin tones in Red Dead Redemption. That's all they do. What they then finish off with to make everything pop, because now you have like the red is a very dark value next to a dark shadow shape. So if you want to pop out your shadows, what they use is a rim light. Now, a rim light usually is a more muted value, but in this case, they really punch it. Like they give it a really big punch. So that's why I left this on purpose to already have that feeling of a rim light, because otherwise I'm going to have to use too much white, and it's going to be hard because this acrylic paint hasn't dried yet. But essentially that's what they end with, right? They end with graphically pleasing shape for the rim light so that everything else pops from the shadow. Because if you want to pop your shadows, especially as everything becomes darker or closer together in value, and you want to make your subject matter stand out, you use a rim light. And I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to add it here, but yeah. So for instance, let's say here for the neck as well, they add like a nice rim light. And again, all of this, or a lot of this at least, is graphic design, right? It's finding pleasing shapes that make the overall image stand out and make it pleasing to look at, right? And so you can see by adding this rim light, we make a lot of that shadow side, we make it pop. And that is it. That's essentially the entire way to get this style. It's not that hard. Or wait, let me rephrase that. It's simple, but of course it's not easy, because you have to understand a lot of concepts. You have to understand form. I always repeat that form is important. If you want to make something believable, and especially if it's a paint and light it, you need to understand the form onto which you're painting. So that's the first thing you need to understand. You also need to understand lighting. You need to understand how cast shadows work, how form shadows work. So you need to understand a lot of concepts before you actually get into this. But the process itself is actually ridiculously simple, because it's essentially have, a line work that frames everything you want to paint. Then you start with the local colors. Then you add that very graphic shadow mapping that is that is for everything except the skin tones, essentially. And then you add dark background, in this case red. You add your first layer of shadow mapping, then you add your halftones, and you add a rim light. So you can actually achieve it in 6 steps. As a last thing, if I were to do it traditionally, I would, of course, also include, right? Let's say my egg still needed a mustache. I would include that, because that's that graphic sort of punch that they give in that style as well, right? So let's say we also wanted to give it eyebrows. There we go. And usually there's also quite a bit of an emphasis on graphically pleasing shapes. So it's not only about making the colors pop, making the shadows pop. There's also a large emphasis on graphic design. That's what makes it probably the hardest, and that will be the hardest for people to grasp, because graphic design takes a lot of experience to make Especially if you want to make things believable and graphically pleasing, like I showcased here, it does take experience. But if you want to take a stab at this style, it is a very straightforward process. It will just take experience to make sure that everything falls into place to make it a pleasing whole. But as always, I really enjoyed replicating this style because I really like the graphic nature of it. I really like the design aspect of it, and it just has a badass sort of vibe to it. So if you enjoyed that, make sure you try it yourself. As always, happy learning, happy drawing, and I'll see you in the next one.